Okay, so in this video, I'm going to show you guys how to simplify square roots using my second method, which is a perfect square method, which I think is personally easier after you get the hang of it, but definitely different than the first method, which I explained to you in the last video. Definitely go see that before you watch this one. But the perfect square method, A, requires you to know your perfect squares, and B, requires you to know a fact about factoring a number. So I'm going to show you both of those things first. So what is a perfect square, which I went over before? A perfect square is when you square a number, what comes out is a perfect square. The reason it's called a perfect square, because if I take 3 and 3 and multiply them together like a square, it is 9. Okay, so 9 is the perfect square. So my perfect squares are 1, which is 1 squared, right? 4, which is 2 squared. 9, which is 3 squared. 4 squared, which is 16. 5 squared, 25. Then 36. Then 49. Then 8 squared, which is 64, right? So I can keep going. I'm actually going to keep going until I hit 100. So 64 is 8 squared, 9 squared is 81, and then I have 100. Okay, those are my first, 10 perfect squares, 1 through 10. So it's really important to know our perfect squares for this method. Also, what is important to know is that the biggest, I'm going to write this, the biggest or the largest, all right, factor of any number is half of that number. Is half of that number. Okay? So what I mean is that if I have a number like 100, right? The biggest factor, I'm going to write the largest factor besides itself, right? So besides itself. So the largest factor of 100 besides 100 is half of 100, right? Or let's look at a smaller number. If we look at like 8, right? The factors of 8 are 1 and 8 multiplied to 8, and then 2 and 4. So the biggest factor is 8 itself, but the second biggest factor is half of 8, which is 4. That is true about any number, even odd numbers, right? So if I have like 9, I have 1 and then 9 and then 3 and 3. Yes, 4.5 is not a factor, but it is the largest thing it could possibly be, right? 3 is its factor. So if I have 80, right? 80 is the biggest number that goes into 80, but then the next biggest number is 40 is the biggest factor. So that's really important with this method. So let's do the exact same problems that we did here in the last video. So let's do the square root of 8. So you are going to find, for this method, you are going to find the largest perfect square that is its factor. Okay, that is really important here. That is the whole method. Okay, what is the largest perfect square that is a factor of this number right here? So the first thing I'm going to do is cut it in half, because I know that half of it, 8 over 2, is 4. That is where I'm going to start. Is 4 a perfect square? Yes, and it is a factor of 8. So 8, the square root of 8 is the same thing as saying the square root of 4 times 2. So I could even rewrite this as the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. And the square root of 4 is 2 root 2. This is the same thing as saying 2, and this can't be simplified any further, so it just stays the same. So the square root of 8 is the same thing as saying 2 root 2, which is what we got here, 2 root 2. I think with a lot less work, but my personal opinion. I think it has a lot more head work than it does paperwork. So if I have, what was the next problem I did here? 45. So the square root of 45. Let's try that out. So you could just think about it if you want, right? What is the biggest perfect square if you look at your list of perfect squares that go into 45? Or what I could say is, what is half of 45? That is where I'm going to start. I'm going to write my perfect squares out. I have 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49. Okay, obviously 49 is not going to be a factor of 45, but I'm going to start with that. Now, you start with cutting it in half. 45 divided by 2 is 22.5. Obviously, 22.5 is not a factor, but again, that is my starting point, meaning anything bigger than 22.5 is going to be out of the question. Here's 22.5. It's in between 16 and 25. So these are all out of the question. So I'm just going to start testing 16, 9, 4, and 1. Okay? So what is 45 divisible by 16? That's your question, right? You can use a calculator for this. Is 45 divisible by 16? It is equal to 2.8. It is not a factor. Goodbye. So that's out. I'm going to write not a factor. Now, is 45 divisible by 9? I just happen to know 45 is divisible by 9, but we can even sit here and say 45 divided by 9 is 5. So from there, I can rewrite this as the square root of 9 times the square root of 5. Square root of 9 is 3 root 5, and there is your answer. Actually, I just want to show you again. Root 5 stays the same. And then this square root of 9 is 3. And so that's my answer. Square root of 45 is equal to 3 root 5. And we'll do one more. Square root of 108, which is what we did in the last video. So square root of 108. Again. And I'm going to actually just rewrite it. 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36. I'm blanking. 36, 49, right? And 49, 64. Okay. So I am going to first cut it in half. 108 over 2 is 54. Okay. So I know I'm going to cut my list right here. This is where 54 is. So that means 64 is completely out. So I'm going to start testing. 49 down. Again, I want, from what I wrote up here, I want the largest perfect square, not just a perfect square. Because I know 108 is divisible by 4, but that doesn't really help me because it might not be the largest perfect square. So I'm going to start dividing. 108 divided by 49. 108 divided by 49. It is not divisible. So I can sit here and say goodbye. 108 divided by 36 is 3. It is a factor. So I can go check and I can go, all right, so I know 108 is equal to square root of 36 times the square root of 3, because 36 times 3 is 108. And then this becomes 6, right? This is 6 root 3, final answer. So these get a lot easier as you get used to them and as you get to really realize your perfect squares. So like if you look at something like the square root of 50, super easy because half of it is 50. I mean, half of it is 25. So this is 25 and 2, which is 5 root 5. 5 root 2, right? So, or if you look at problems like the square root of 300. If you try to find the prime factors of 300, you have 3 and, or let's do 10 and 30, right? 2 and 5, 2 and 15, 2 and like this gets a lot, right? Versus recognizing that 100 is the biggest perfect square that goes into this. 100 times 3, which is 10 root 3. It gets a lot easier than having to rewrite this as 2 times 2 times 2 times 3 times 5, and then this is actually a 5 here. 3 times 5. So it's 2 times 2 times 3 times 5 times 5, and then this comes out and this comes. It's just a lot more. It's doable. It just, I think, has a lot more paperwork and a lot more tedious effort than just recognizing 100 is the biggest perfect square. And then you're done.